"Put him out before he ruins the evening," the manager shouted. Just as Bruno Mars stood up from his table and every conversation inside the luxury restaurant died at once. The words seemed to hang beneath the golden chandeliers, sharper than the clinking glasses and softer only than the rain pounding against the enormous windows. Bruno slowly lowered his fork. Across the room, a homeless man stood trembling beside the entrance, his soaked jacket dripping onto the polished marble floor, his hands wrapped tightly around an old paper envelope. Some guests stared with disgust. Others looked away as if pretending the man did not exist. A woman at the nearest table whispered that he smelled terrible. A businessman laughed under his breath. The restaurant manager, Adrian Cole, approached the stranger with a forced smile that barely concealed his anger. "Sir, this establishment is not a shelter. You need to leave." The homeless man swallowed hard. "I only need 5 minutes," he whispered. "I was told someone here could help me." "Nobody here is going to help you," Adrian replied coldly. "You don't belong in a place like this." The man lowered his eyes. His name was Daniel. His shoes were worn through. His gray hair was plastered against his forehead by the rain, and his fingers shook whenever he tried to hold the envelope steady. But there was something unusual about the way he looked around the room. He wasn't looking at the expensive paintings, the crystal chandeliers, or the wealthy guests. He was searching for someone. Then his eyes stopped on Bruno. For one strange second, Daniel's expression changed. Fear disappeared. Recognition took its place. Bruno noticed it. He pushed his chair backward and stood. "Wait." The manager froze. "Mr. Mars, please don't get involved." Bruno looked at him. "Why?" Adrian hesitated. "Because this is a private dining establishment." Bruno glanced toward Daniel, then back at the manager. "And apparently tonight it's also a place where people are judged by what they wear." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone lowered their phone. Bruno walked toward the entrance. His shoes tapped against the marble as the rain continued beating against the glass. Daniel looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Bruno stopped a few feet away from him. "You didn't." Daniel stared at him. "They said I was disturbing everyone." Bruno turned toward the room. "You know what's disturbing?" Nobody answered. Bruno's voice became quieter. "Watching a room full of people with enough money to buy anything decide that someone's dignity is too expensive." Silence spread across the restaurant. Adrian's face reddened. "Mr. Mars, this is becoming inappropriate." Bruno looked at him. "No. What's inappropriate is humiliating a man because he's poor." Daniel's hands tightened around the envelope. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want you to fight with them because of me." Bruno looked directly into his eyes. "Then tell me why you're here." Daniel hesitated. For several seconds the only sound was the rain. Finally he raised the envelope. "Because this belongs to someone who used to eat here every Friday." Bruno's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Daniel looked toward an empty table near the window. There was an old photograph sitting beneath a silver vase, almost hidden behind a candle. "Her." Bruno followed his gaze. The photograph showed a young woman smiling beside an older man. The woman looked familiar. Very familiar. Bruno's expression changed. "Where did you get that?" Daniel looked down. "From your mother." The restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Bruno stared at him. "What did you just say?" Daniel's voice trembled. "Your mother gave me this envelope 17 years ago." Bruno slowly reached for it, but Daniel pulled it back. "She told me never to open it unless I found you." Bruno's heart began pounding. "Why would my mother give you something 17 years ago?" Daniel looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Because she knew what would happen to me if I told the truth." Bruno stopped moving. The manager stepped closer. "This is ridiculous. Sir, you need to leave immediately." Bruno raised one hand. "Nobody touches him." Adrian froze. Bruno turned toward Daniel again. "Sit down." Daniel looked confused. "What?" "You're having dinner with me." A murmur moved through the room. Daniel shook his head. "I can't afford this." Bruno pulled out the chair across from his table. "I didn't ask you to pay." Daniel stared at the chair as if it were something forbidden. Then slowly he walked across the restaurant. Every step left tiny drops of rainwater on the marble. Bruno waited until Daniel sat down. A waiter approached nervously. Bruno looked at him. Bring him whatever he wants. Daniel immediately shook his head. Just coffee. Bruno smiled faintly. Coffee? Daniel nodded. Black. No sugar. Bruno looked at the waiter. Coffee, steak, potatoes, vegetables, dessert, and whatever else he wants. Daniel almost laughed despite himself. I haven't eaten like that in years. Bruno's smile disappeared. Then tonight you will. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked at someone without fear. But the mystery of the envelope remained between them. Bruno could not stop staring at it. 17 years. His mother. A homeless man. A secret that had apparently survived nearly 2 decades. And somewhere inside that envelope was an answer to a question Bruno had never realized he was supposed to ask. As the waiter brought the food, Daniel finally whispered, Your mother wasn't the person people thought she was. Bruno's fingers tightened around his glass. What does that mean? Daniel looked toward the restaurant's private hallway. It means someone spent years making sure nobody discovered what she did. Bruno followed his gaze. A man in a black suit stood in the shadows near the hallway, watching them. Daniel saw him too. His face suddenly went pale. He's here. Bruno turned. Who? Daniel lowered his voice. The reason I became homeless. The man's eyes met Bruno's for one brief moment before he disappeared behind the door. Bruno stood immediately. Daniel grabbed his wrist. Don't. Bruno looked down. Why? Daniel whispered. Because if he knows I found you, everything changes. Bruno slowly sat back down. The restaurant continued pretending everything was normal. But Bruno knew it wasn't. He opened his hand. Give me the envelope. Daniel stared at him. Then he placed it on the table. Bruno touched the old paper with trembling fingers. He had spent his entire life believing his mother had told him everything important. Now, sitting across from a man society had dismissed as worthless, he realized how wrong he might have been. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter and a photograph. Bruno unfolded the paper. The first line made his breath stop. Bruno, if you are reading this, Daniel kept his promise. Bruno's eyes filled with tears as he continued reading. And if Daniel is sitting beside you, then the person who destroyed his life is probably watching you right now. Bruno looked up. Across the restaurant, the man in the black suit had returned. This time he was smiling. And Bruno suddenly understood that the homeless man everyone had just humiliated might not have entered the restaurant looking for help at all. He had entered looking for justice. Bruno did not look away from the man in the black suit. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The restaurant had returned to its polished illusion of normality, but Bruno could feel something underneath it now. Something cold and deliberate, like a second heartbeat hiding beneath the music. Daniel sat across from him with both hands wrapped around his untouched coffee, his knuckles white from tension. Don't stare at him, Daniel whispered. Bruno kept his eyes on the man. Why? Because that's what he wants. Bruno finally looked down at the letter. Who is he? Daniel swallowed. His name is Victor Hale. The name meant nothing to Bruno at first. Then something in the letter caught his attention. He read the sentence again. Victor Hale. Daniel nodded. He worked for your family once. Bruno's expression hardened. My family. Your father trusted him. The words landed heavily. Bruno slowly folded the letter. My father never mentioned him. Daniel gave a bitter smile. That's because your father spent the last years of his life trying to forget him. A waiter approached the table with a plate of steak, but Daniel suddenly pushed it away. I can't eat. Bruno frowned. You haven't eaten all day. I'm not hungry anymore. Daniel. Please. His voice cracked. You don't understand what you've just walked into. Bruno leaned forward. Then help me understand. Daniel stared at him. His eyes were exhausted, but behind the exhaustion was something Bruno had not noticed before. Guilt. Not ordinary guilt. The kind that had been carried so long it had become part of a person's identity. Your mother gave me that letter because she knew she couldn't protect me forever. Bruno's jaw tightened. Protect you from Victor? Daniel nodded. From him and from people who worked for him. What did you do? Daniel looked away. I made a mistake. What kind of mistake? Daniel's fingers trembled against the cup. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Bruno waited. Daniel finally whispered. The night your father disappeared from the family business, I was there. Bruno's breathing slowed. My father didn't disappear. Daniel looked at him. That's what everyone told you. Bruno felt the room tilt slightly. His father had died years ago, and the official story had always been simple. Business pressure, illness, exhaustion, a life consumed by responsibilities. Bruno had grown up with fragments of memories, a stern voice, an old watch, the smell of his father's cologne, and one strange rule his mother had repeated whenever the subject came up. Never ask about that night. Bruno had obeyed because children believed adults knew the truth. Now, decades later, a homeless man was telling him that the truth had been buried. Bruno whispered. What happened to my father? Daniel opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the restaurant lights flickered. Every head turned toward the ceiling. The music stopped. For 1 second, the entire room went dark. Then the emergency lights came on. Daniel was gone. Bruno shot to his feet. Daniel! His chair crashed backward. He looked toward the entrance. Empty. Toward the kitchen. Empty. Toward the private hallway. Nothing. Daniel! Bruno pushed through the tables. Guests stared as he moved rapidly toward the corridor. Adrian, the manager, tried to stop him. Mr. Mars, you can't go back there. Bruno shoved his hand away. Where is he? Who? The man who was sitting with me. Adrian's expression remained strangely calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Bruno stared at him. He was here 30 seconds ago. Perhaps he left. Bruno's voice dropped. The front door is guarded by security. Adrian said nothing. Bruno pushed through the hallway door. The corridor smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. At the end was a service exit. It stood open. Rain blew through the doorway, scattering drops across the floor. Bruno ran outside. The alley behind the restaurant was almost completely empty. A delivery truck idled nearby. Its headlights illuminated the wet pavement. Bruno shouted, Daniel! Nothing. Then he saw something lying beside a trash container. The old envelope. Bruno rushed toward it. The letter was gone. Only the photograph remained. He picked it up. The image showed his mother standing beside Daniel when Daniel was much younger. Behind them stood a building Bruno recognized immediately. His childhood home. But there was something else in the photograph. A man stood in the background. Victor Hale. Bruno stared at the image until his fingers began shaking. Someone had deliberately removed the letter. Someone had taken Daniel. And someone had known exactly where Bruno would be tonight. A voice came from behind him. You should go home. Bruno turned sharply. Victor stood beneath the restaurant's awning, perfectly dry despite the rain. Bruno held up the photograph. Where is he? Victor's face showed no emotion. I don't know who you're talking about. Don't lie to me. Victor smiled faintly. You're angry. You kidnapped him. That's a serious accusation. Bruno stepped closer. Where is Daniel? Victor looked at the photograph in Bruno's hand. For the first time, something changed in his eyes. Fear. It lasted less than a second, but Bruno saw it. Give me the photograph. Bruno laughed without humor. Absolutely not. Victor's voice became quieter. You don't understand what that picture means. Then explain it. I can't. You mean you won't? Victor stared at him. Your mother asked me to keep you safe. Bruno froze. My mother asked you? Years ago. From what? Victor looked toward the dark street. From the truth. Bruno felt anger rising in his chest. Everyone keeps saying that. My mother. Daniel. You. What truth is so dangerous that everyone has spent my entire life protecting me from it? Victor looked directly into his eyes. The truth about your father. Before Bruno could answer, a car suddenly accelerated down the street. Its headlights swept across them. Victor stepped backward. Bruno turned instinctively toward the vehicle. When he looked back, Victor was gone. Bruno ran to the street, but the car disappeared around the corner. He stood in the rain holding the photograph. For the first time in his life, he felt something more frightening than fear. He felt betrayed by people who were no longer alive to explain themselves. Back inside the restaurant, The atmosphere had become uncomfortable. Guests whispered about what had happened. Some had already begun filming. Bruno returned through the entrance soaked from the rain. Adrian approached him immediately. "Mr. Mars, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Bruno looked at him. "Did you know Daniel?" Adrian's face stiffened. "No." "Did you know Victor Hale?" Silence. Bruno stepped closer. "Answer me." Adrian glanced toward the dining room. "Not here." "Then where?" Adrian looked toward the private elevator. "Upstairs." Bruno followed him. They entered a small office overlooking the restaurant. The windows were covered with rain, turning the city lights into blurred golden streaks. Adrian closed the door. "You need to stop asking questions." Bruno crossed his arms. "That's not happening." Adrian sighed. "Your mother used to come here." Bruno stared at him. "How do you know?" "Because this restaurant belonged to my father." Bruno's eyes narrowed. "And my mother knew him?" "Very well." Adrian opened a drawer and removed an old ledger. "Your mother and father came here regularly. Your father was working on a project that involved several investors." Bruno looked at the ledger. "What project?" Adrian hesitated. "A foundation." "For what?" "To provide housing and employment for people who had nowhere to go." Bruno's expression changed. "Homeless people?" Adrian nodded. "Your father wanted to build a network of shelters, training centers, and affordable housing. Daniel was one of the people involved." Bruno looked down at the ledger. "So why did it fail?" Adrian's face became grim. "It didn't fail." Bruno looked up. "Then what happened?" "The money disappeared." Bruno's stomach tightened. "How much?" "Millions." Adrian opened another page. Several names were listed. At the bottom was a signature. Victor Hale. Bruno stared at it. "He stole it." "That's what your father believed." "Then why wasn't he arrested?" Adrian shook his head. "Because before your father could expose him, the evidence disappeared." Bruno's voice became quieter. "And my father?" Adrian closed the ledger. 2 days later he vanished. Bruno felt his throat tighten. "You said he died." Adrian looked away. "That's what the family announced." Bruno stepped closer. "You're telling me my father disappeared and my family pretended he died?" "Your mother believed it was the only way to keep you safe." Bruno stared at him. "Safe from what?" Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a cabinet and pulled out an old box. Inside was a cassette tape. "Your father left this here." Bruno stared at it. The ringing stopped the moment Bruno's hand touched the storage room door, leaving behind a silence so complete that he could hear the rainwater dripping through the old pipes above him. Adrian stood several steps behind him, breathing unevenly, his face drained of color. But Bruno no longer had the patience to be afraid of what might be waiting on the other side, because after everything he had learned that night, uncertainty had become more painful than any truth could possibly be. He pushed the door open. A narrow beam of light from the basement ceiling slipped inside, revealing shelves covered with dusty boxes, old restaurant records, broken chairs, wine crates, and at the very back a small wooden desk. On the desk sat an old black telephone. It was ringing again. Bruno walked toward it slowly. Adrian whispered his name, but Bruno didn't stop. He picked up the receiver. "Hello." For several seconds there was only static. Then a man's voice emerged, weak and distant. "Bruno." Bruno froze. The receiver almost slipped from his hand. He knew that voice. Not because he had heard it recently, but because some voices never truly disappeared from memory. His father's voice had lived inside old recordings, faded home videos, childhood memories, and dreams he had never understood. "Dad," Bruno whispered. Adrian covered his mouth. The voice on the phone became clearer. "Listen carefully. You don't have much time." Bruno's eyes widened. "Where are you?" "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "Bruno, there are things your mother never told you because she believed silence would protect you." Bruno swallowed. "Was she protecting me from Victor?" The voice hesitated. "Victor isn't the enemy you think he is." Bruno looked at Adrian. Adrian's eyes filled with tears. "Then who is?" Bruno asked. The voice said nothing for several seconds. "You need to find Daniel." Bruno's grip tightened around the receiver. "He's been taken." "No." Daniel left willingly. Bruno shook his head. Why would he disappear? Because he knows what happens when people discover the records. Bruno's heart pounded. What records? The original foundation records. They contain every transfer, every name, every payment, every person who benefited from the money. And Victor. Victor was trying to expose them. Bruno closed his eyes. Suddenly, everything he had believed about the mysterious man in the black suit began to collapse. Then why did he threaten Daniel? Because Daniel misunderstood him. What happened to you? Bruno asked. Silence. Dad. The line crackled. I trusted the wrong person. Bruno's voice trembled. Who? The answer came softly. Someone you have known your entire life. The line went dead. Bruno stood motionless with the receiver against his ear. Adrian slowly approached. What did he say? Bruno turned toward him. He said Victor isn't the enemy. Adrian looked terrified. Then you need to leave. Not without answers. Bruno, please. You knew about this phone. I knew it existed. You knew my father was alive? Adrian's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if he's alive now. Bruno stared at him. But you did once. Adrian lowered his head. Yes. Bruno felt something inside him crack. How long? 17 years. You let me believe he was dead for 17 years. Your mother made me promise. Bruno's voice rose. Everyone made promises. My mother promised to protect me. You promised to keep secrets. Daniel promised to stay silent. Victor promised something to my father. And now I'm standing in a basement talking to a ghost through an old telephone. Adrian flinched. Your father wasn't a ghost. Then where is he? Adrian looked toward the desk. I don't know. Bruno stared at him. You do know something. Adrian slowly sat on an old wooden crate. The night your father disappeared, he came here. Bruno remained standing. Why? He had discovered the money trail. He knew the foundation had been compromised. By Victor. No, Adrian looked directly at Bruno. By someone much closer. Bruno's expression hardened. My mother. Adrian shook his head. No, then who? Adrian hesitated. Your father's closest business partner. Bruno frowned. Who was that? Marcus Vale. The name struck Bruno with unexpected familiarity. He had heard it before. His mother had mentioned Marcus only once when Bruno was a child. She had called him an old family friend. Bruno remembered a tall man with silver hair, expensive suits, and a habit of tapping 2 fingers against a table whenever he was thinking. Marcus is dead, Bruno said. Adrian nodded. He died 6 years ago. Then how could he have betrayed my father? Because betrayal doesn't require someone to be alive when the truth finally surfaces. Bruno looked at the old phone. What did Marcus do? Adrian took a deep breath. He redirected money from your father's foundation into private accounts. But he didn't do it alone. Who helped him? Adrian's voice dropped. Several people. Names. I don't remember all of them. Bruno slammed his hand against the desk. You remember enough. Adrian looked frightened. One of those people owned the restaurant. Bruno stared at him. Your father. No, Adrian looked toward the ceiling. My father wasn't the owner when your father disappeared. Bruno's eyes narrowed. Who was? Adrian whispered. Marcus Vale. The revelation made Bruno step backward. The restaurant wasn't simply connected to the story. It had been one of the places where the entire conspiracy had been built. Every elegant dinner, every private meeting, every handshake between wealthy men might have hidden something darker beneath the polished surface. Bruno looked around the basement with new eyes. The dusty shelves no longer looked abandoned. They looked like a graveyard of secrets. Why did my father come here? Adrian said. Because he knew Marcus kept copies of the financial records in this building. Bruno looked toward the storage room. And did he find them? Yes. Then where are they? Adrian stared at the telephone. Your father took them. Where? He never told me. Bruno paced through the room. Daniel knows. Probably. And Victor. Victor knows more than he admits. Bruno stopped. Then why did he come here tonight? Adrian hesitated. To make sure you didn't discover everything at once. Bruno looked confused. Why would he care? Because your father made him promise something. What? Adrian looked at him. To protect you. Bruno's anger weakened slightly. From what? Adrian's answer came almost as a whisper. From the people who wanted your father's work destroyed. Bruno leaned against the desk. The emotional weight of the night finally began to settle into his body. He had walked into the restaurant expecting an ordinary dinner. Instead, he had discovered that a stranger had been carrying his family's secret for 17 years, that his father might have survived the night everyone believed he died, and that the man he had assumed was his enemy might actually have been protecting him. Yet one question remained. Why did Daniel come to me tonight? Adrian answered immediately. Because he was running out of time. Bruno looked at him. What does that mean? Adrian reached inside his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He gave me this yesterday. Bruno took it. The paper contained an address. Nothing else. Where is this? An old community center outside the city. Bruno looked up. That's where my father wanted to build the first shelter. Adrian nodded. The project was never completed. Bruno folded the paper. I'm going there. Not alone. Bruno looked at him. You're coming. Adrian hesitated. If I go with you, I may not come back. Bruno gave him a hard stare. You owe me 17 years of answers. Adrian nodded slowly. Then let's go. They left through the rear entrance. The rain had weakened into a cold mist. Bruno sat behind the wheel of his car while Adrian took the passenger seat. Neither spoke for several minutes. The city passed around them in blurred lights. Bruno kept thinking about Daniel's face when he had entered the restaurant. The embarrassment. The fear. The envelope. The way he had looked at Bruno as though he were looking at someone else's son. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. There's something else you need to know. Bruno kept his eyes on the road. What? Your mother didn't just give Daniel the letter. Bruno's hands tightened around the steering wheel. What else did she give him? A key. To what? A safety deposit box. Bruno looked at him. Where? Adrian shook his head. I don't know. Then how do you know it exists? Because I saw the key. When? The night your father disappeared. Bruno's stomach tightened. You were there. Yes. You watched him leave. Yes. And you watched my mother give Daniel something. Yes. Bruno's voice became quieter. Why didn't you tell me? Adrian stared out the window. Because your mother looked at me and said, if Bruno ever asks, tell him his father chose. The old family house appeared through the fog like a memory that had refused to die. Its dark windows staring down at Bruno as he stepped from the car. And the first thing he noticed was that the front door was already open. Bruno stopped on the driveway. Adrian immediately reached for his arm. Don't go inside. Bruno stared at the doorway. Someone is already there. Daniel looked toward the upstairs windows, his face suddenly tense. Not someone, he whispered. They've been waiting for you. Bruno felt the cold air settle against his skin. The house had been empty for years, yet warm yellow light flickered behind one of the curtains. He remembered this place differently. As a child, it had smelled of coffee, polished wood, his mother's perfume, and his father's old leather jacket. Now it smelled of dust, damp walls, and something faintly metallic. Bruno walked toward the entrance. The wooden floor creaked beneath his shoes. Stay behind me, Adrian said. Bruno shook his head. No. I've spent too long letting other people stand between me and the truth. They entered the hallway. Nothing moved. Old family photographs remained on the walls, their frames covered in dust. Bruno stopped beside one photograph of himself as a child sitting on his father's shoulders. His father was smiling. His mother stood beside them, her hand resting gently on Bruno's back. For a moment, the conspiracy disappeared, and Bruno was simply a son looking at a family that had once felt safe. Then he noticed something strange. His father's eyes in the photograph were not looking at the camera. They were looking toward the basement door. Bruno stepped closer. Behind the photograph was a small mark carved into the frame. 3 letters. BM, what does that mean? Adrian asked. Bruno touched it. My father used to leave me little marks when we played hide and seek. Daniel shook his head. This wasn't a game. Bruno turned toward him. Then what was it? Daniel pointed toward the basement. A message. They descended the stairs. Every step seemed to awaken another memory. Bruno remembered running down these stairs when he was 6. He remembered his father shouting his name one night. He remembered his mother locking the basement door and telling him never to open it. At the bottom, Bruno found the old wooden door. The lock had been broken long ago. He pushed it open. The room beyond was larger than he remembered. Shelves lined the walls. Dusty boxes covered the floor. A workbench stood beneath a narrow window. On the wall hung a map of the city, covered with red pins and handwritten notes. Bruno walked toward it. What is this? Adrian stared at the map. Your father was tracking the money. Bruno looked closer. Several restaurants, banks, offices, and properties had been marked. One location had been circled repeatedly. The luxury restaurant where Bruno had met Daniel. Bruno's expression hardened. So this place wasn't random. Daniel shook his head. No. Your father believed the restaurant was the center of the operation. Bruno turned. And Adrian's family owned it. Adrian looked down. Yes. Bruno's eyes narrowed. You knew. I knew pieces. You knew enough. Adrian swallowed. I was 19 when your father disappeared. And you helped him? I tried. That's not an answer. Adrian looked at the map. I was afraid. Bruno stepped toward him. Everyone was afraid. My father was afraid. My mother was afraid. Daniel was afraid. Victor was afraid. But someone kept making decisions while everyone else was afraid. Daniel whispered. That person wasn't Marcus. Bruno turned toward him. You said my father's brother was behind it. Daniel nodded. Your father had an older half-brother named Elias. Bruno stared at him. Elias. Adrian's expression changed. Your mother never told you because Elias was supposed to be dead. Bruno's stomach tightened. Supposed to be? Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Bruno. The picture showed Bruno's father standing beside another man who looked remarkably similar. Same eyes. Same jaw. Same habit of standing with one hand tucked into his jacket. On the back was a date from 20 years earlier and one sentence in his mother's handwriting. He came back. Bruno stared at the photograph. Why did my mother tell me I was an only child? Adrian looked confused. What does that have to do with Elias? Bruno turned the photograph over again. His face changed. Because there was another child. Daniel went silent. What? Bruno pointed at the handwriting. Beneath the first sentence was a second line he had not noticed before. Elias did not return alone. The room became unnaturally quiet. Adrian whispered. Your father had another child? Bruno shook his head. I don't know. Daniel stepped closer. Your mother never mentioned a daughter? Bruno's memory suddenly shifted. A small bedroom upstairs. A music box. A little girl's voice. A photograph he had once found inside a drawer. His mother had taken it away immediately. Bruno had always assumed it belonged to a cousin. There was a girl, he whispered. Adrian looked stunned. Who? Bruno closed his eyes. I don't remember her name. Daniel looked at the map. Then we need to find the records. Bruno searched the shelves. Boxes were labeled with dates, company names, and initials. He opened one after another until he found a small metal box. Inside were birth certificates, financial documents, passports, and newspaper clippings. Bruno's hands trembled as he searched through them. Then he found a document with his mother's signature. It wasn't a birth certificate. It was a guardianship agreement. The child's name was Elena Vale. Bruno stared at it. Vale. Daniel's face went pale. Elias's daughter. Bruno looked up. Then why was she living here? Daniel shook his head. She wasn't supposed to. What does that mean? Daniel pointed toward the basement wall. Look. Bruno followed his finger. A faded line had been scratched into the concrete. Elena knows. Bruno stepped backward. Knows what? Before anyone could answer, a sound came from upstairs. A door slammed. All three men froze. Adrian whispered. Someone came in. Bruno grabbed a flashlight. They moved silently toward the stairs. Footsteps crossed the hallway above them. Slow. Deliberate. Then the footsteps stopped. Bruno reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was empty. A cold draft moved through the house. One of the bedroom doors was slightly open. Bruno pushed it wider. Inside was a child's bedroom. The walls were faded pink. An old music box sat on a shelf. Bruno approached it slowly. He touched the lid. The box began playing by itself. A soft, broken melody filled the room. Bruno's eyes widened. I remember this. Daniel stared at him. What? She used to play this. Who? Bruno looked at the empty bed. Elena. A photograph lay on the pillow. Bruno picked it up. It showed a little girl standing beside his father. On the back was another message. If Bruno ever remembers her, tell him she survived. Bruno's heart slammed against his ribs. She survived. Adrian whispered. Then where is she? A voice answered from the doorway. Closer than you think. Bruno turned. A woman stood there. She was perhaps in her late 20s, wearing a dark coat, her hair wet from the rain, her expression calm but wounded. She looked at Bruno with eyes that immediately felt strangely familiar. Bruno stared at her. Who are you? The woman took one step forward. My name is Elena. Daniel covered his mouth. Adrian stepped backward. Bruno couldn't speak. Elena looked at the photograph in his hand. You finally remembered me. Bruno's voice came out barely above a whisper. You were here. I grew up here. Why don't I remember you? Elena's eyes filled with sadness. Because your mother made sure you forgot. Bruno shook his head. Why? Elena looked toward the basement stairs. Because if you remembered me, you would eventually remember what happened to your father. Bruno stared at her. What happened to him? Elena took a breath. He didn't leave because he was afraid of Victor or Marcus. She stepped closer. He left because Elias threatened to kill you. Bruno felt the blood drain from his face. My uncle. Elena nodded. He wanted the foundation. He wanted your father's money. And when your father refused to give it to him, Elias threatened the only thing your father loved more than his work. Bruno's eyes filled with tears. Me? Yes. Bruno looked down at the photograph. Then why did you survive? Elena's expression became complicated. Because Elias didn't know my mother had hidden me. Bruno looked at her. Your mother? Elena nodded. She was your father's first love. Silence. Adrian looked at Daniel. Daniel closed his eyes. Bruno's mind raced. The family history he thought he knew was dissolving around him. My father had another family. Elena nodded. Before the front door swung inward with a slow wooden groan, and Bruno saw the man standing beneath the porch light, older than the photograph but unmistakably familiar. His silver hair wet from the rain and his expression disturbingly calm, as if he had not come to threaten anyone but simply to collect something that already belonged to him. Elias! Elena whispered again, her voice barely audible. Bruno stepped in front of her. Daniel moved toward the window while Adrian locked the basement door. Elias remained outside, staring directly through the glass at Bruno. Then he smiled. You've grown, he said. Bruno's blood ran cold. He had never met this man before, yet Elias spoke as though he had watched him grow up. How do you know me? Bruno demanded. Elias slowly removed his gloves. Because your father talked about you every time I saw him. Bruno's jaw tightened. You knew my father? Better than anyone. Elena stepped forward. You threatened him. Elias looked at her. I threatened everyone. You tried to kill him. No, Elias replied calmly. I tried to stop him from destroying the family. Bruno stared at the man. What family? Elias laughed softly. The one your mother spent 17 years pretending didn't exist. Bruno felt anger rising. You have 5 seconds to explain why you're here. Elias looked at him through the doorway. I'm here because Daniel took something that belongs to me. Daniel froze. Bruno turned. What did you take? Daniel slowly shook his head. Nothing. Elias smiled. That's a lie. Bruno looked between them. What is he talking about? Daniel reached into his coat and removed a small black notebook. This. Elias's expression changed for the first time. Give it to me. Daniel held it tightly. No, Elias stepped inside. The men behind him remained on the porch. Bruno moved closer. What is that? Daniel looked at him. Your father's original ledger. Bruno stared at the notebook. The records. Daniel nodded. Every transaction. Every name. Every secret. Elias's voice hardened. Give it to me, Daniel. No. Elias took another step. You have no idea what you're carrying. Daniel looked at Bruno. I know exactly what I'm carrying. Elias suddenly reached inside his coat. Adrian grabbed Bruno and pulled him backward. A loud crack shattered the silence. The mirror behind them exploded. Elena screamed. Everyone dropped to the floor. Bruno's ears rang. Adrian pulled him behind a heavy cabinet. Stay down. Another shot struck the wall. Daniel crawled toward the basement door. Elias shouted from the hallway. This is your last warning. Bruno looked at Elena. She was trembling but strangely focused. There's another exit, she whispered. Where? Behind the library. They crawled through the hallway while bullets struck the walls behind them. The house that had once been Bruno's childhood sanctuary had become a battlefield. Elena pushed open a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. A narrow passage appeared. Go! Bruno followed her inside. Adrian and Daniel came behind them. The panel closed just as another shot echoed through the house. They moved through the dark passage, their footsteps muffled by years of dust. Bruno's breathing was heavy. Where does this lead? Elena whispered. To the old greenhouse. Why is there a secret tunnel beneath my house? Because your father built it. Bruno stopped. For what? Elena turned. Escape. They emerged beneath an abandoned greenhouse behind the property. Rain struck the broken glass overhead. Daniel bent over, breathing heavily. Bruno looked at him. You knew this existed? Yes. How many secrets are you still hiding? Daniel lowered his eyes. Enough to keep you alive. Bruno shook his head. I'm tired of being protected by lies. Elena stepped between them. He's right. Daniel looked at her. Elena. No. He's old enough now. She turned toward Bruno. Your father didn't just build this tunnel for himself. Bruno waited. He built it for us. Us. For you, me, and my mother. Bruno's expression changed. He wanted to bring us together. Elena nodded. He believed the foundation could become something bigger than money. He wanted people who had nothing to have somewhere safe to go. That's why he trusted Daniel. That's why he trusted Victor. That's why he fought Elias. Bruno looked down. And that's why he disappeared. The warehouse doors exploded inward before Bruno could answer, sending a violent gust of cold river air through the building as several black vehicles stopped outside and men in dark coats rushed through the entrance. But Elias did something Bruno never expected. He stepped between them and Bruno, raised both hands and shouted, "Nobody touches him." The men stopped. Bruno stared at the man he had spent the entire night believing was responsible for his family's destruction. Yet Elias's expression contained no triumph, no anger, and no satisfaction. There was only fear. "Stay behind me," Elias said. Bruno shook his head. "I'm done hiding behind people." "This isn't about pride," Elias snapped. "It's about survival." Daniel grabbed the ledger and moved toward Elena. Adrian ducked behind a concrete pillar as the warehouse filled with shouting voices. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, with silver hair and a calm expression that seemed completely out of place amid the chaos. Bruno recognized him from photographs stored inside his father's documents. "Marcus Vale," Bruno whispered. Elena's face went white. Elias turned sharply. "That's impossible." The older man smiled. "Not impossible. Just inconvenient." Daniel stepped backward. "You died." Marcus looked at him. "People believe what they're told." Bruno stared at the man. "You're alive." Marcus nodded. "And your father was alive too." The words made Bruno's chest tighten. "Where is he?" Marcus didn't answer. Bruno moved forward. Elias grabbed his shoulder. "Don't." Bruno pulled away. "You don't get to tell me what to do." Marcus smiled faintly. "There is your father's son." Bruno looked directly at him. "Where is my father?" Marcus's expression became almost sympathetic. "That depends on what you mean by where." Bruno clenched his fists. "Stop speaking in riddles." Marcus slowly walked closer. Your father discovered something that powerful people spend fortunes keeping hidden. The foundation? The foundation was only the beginning. Marcus looked toward the ledger. Your father discovered that the money wasn't simply being stolen. It was being redirected into a network designed to control people. Bruno frowned. Control them how? Marcus answered quietly. Through debt, housing, employment, charity, political influence, and fear. Daniel whispered. The foundation was supposed to help people escape poverty. Exactly, Marcus said. But someone transformed it into a system where people became dependent on the same people who exploited them. Bruno looked at Elias. And you were part of it? Elias shook his head. I tried to stop it. Marcus laughed. You tried to take control of it. Elias's expression hardened. Because you were going to destroy everything. Bruno stepped between them. Enough. Both men looked at him. My father, Bruno said. Tell me what happened to him. Marcus studied him for several seconds. Your father discovered the network and prepared to expose everyone involved. Including you. Marcus nodded. Especially me. Then why didn't you kill him? Marcus's eyes became colder. Because your father was useful. Bruno felt disgust rise in his throat. Useful. He had access to people I couldn't reach. He had credibility. He had money. And most importantly, he had your mother's trust. Bruno froze. My mother. Marcus nodded. She knew more than she ever told you. Did she betray him? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Elena. Ask her. Elena stepped backward. No, Bruno turned toward her. What does he mean? Elena's eyes filled with tears. Your mother made a deal. What kind of deal? She agreed to help Marcus access the foundation's accounts. Bruno's face went pale. Why? To save you. From Elias? From everyone. Marcus interrupted. She knew the foundation was compromised. She knew your father was being watched. She knew you would become leverage. Bruno stared at him. So she betrayed my father. Marcus shook his head. She betrayed the people who believed they could control him. Daniel stepped forward. That's not the whole truth. Marcus looked at him. You always did have a problem with incomplete stories. Daniel's voice trembled. Tell him about Maria. The room became silent. Marcus's expression changed. You shouldn't have said that name. Bruno immediately looked at Daniel. Who is Maria? Marcus turned toward him. Your father loved Maria before he met your mother. Bruno's heart sank. Elena's mother. Marcus nodded. Maria was the original architect of the foundation. Elena stared at Marcus. You said she died. I said many things. Where is she? Marcus looked at Bruno. Alive. Elena's eyes widened. Where? Marcus ignored her. Your father and Maria discovered the network together. When they realized how deeply it had spread, they created a plan to hide the original funds. Bruno remembered the photograph. The woman holding a baby. The guardian. Marcus nodded. Maria became the guardian. Then why did my father leave with her? Marcus looked toward the river. Because they needed to disappear. Bruno stepped closer. Did he choose to leave me? Marcus's expression softened. No. Then why didn't he come back? Marcus hesitated. Because he was afraid that if he returned, they would kill you. Bruno's eyes filled with tears. Who? Marcus looked directly at him. Your mother's own brother. Bruno turned toward Elias. You. Elias closed his eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. But you threatened my father. Yes. You threatened my family. Yes. Then why should I believe anything you say? Elias looked at him with tears in his eyes. Because I spent 17 years regretting it. Marcus interrupted. Regret doesn't erase blood. Elias turned sharply. Neither does ambition. Marcus's smile disappeared. The two men stared at each other like survivors of the same war who had spent years pretending they were enemies rather than admitting they had once stood on the same side. Bruno finally understood something. Everyone in this warehouse had lied. But they had lied for different reasons. Some for money. Some for power. Some for fear. And some because they believed silence could protect the people they loved. Then a single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. One of Marcus's men collapsed. Everyone turned toward the upper walkway. Victor Hale stood there holding a weapon, his expression grim. "Marcus," he said. "It's over." Marcus looked up. "You always were late." Victor's eyes moved to Bruno. "Are you hurt?" Bruno shook his head. No. Victor descended the metal stairs. "Good." Marcus laughed. "You still pretend you're protecting him." Victor stopped. "I am." "You couldn't protect his father." Victor's jaw tightened. "I tried." Bruno looked at him. "What happened to my father?" Victor stared at him for a long moment. "He asked me to do something I couldn't forgive myself for doing." "What?" Victor looked toward Daniel. "He asked me to make you believe he was dead." Bruno's voice broke. "Why?" "Because Elias had found out where you lived." Elias looked away. Victor continued. "Your father believed that if everyone thought he was dead, the attention would disappear." Bruno whispered. "But it didn't." No. Victor's voice softened. "Because someone kept searching." "Marcus." Victor nodded. "And eventually they found Maria." Elena stepped forward. "What happened to my mother?" Victor looked at her. "She escaped." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Where is she?" Victor hesitated. "I don't know." Marcus smiled. "I do." Everyone turned toward him. Marcus reached inside his coat and removed an old photograph. He held it up. Bruno stared. The photograph showed Maria standing outside a small house near the ocean. Beside her was Bruno's father. Both looked older, but they were alive. Bruno's knees nearly gave out. "When was that taken?" 3 years ago." Bruno's breath stopped. 3 years. Marcus nodded. "Your father survived." Bruno stared at the photograph as tears rolled down his cheeks. "Where?" Marcus lowered it. "That information has a price." Elias stepped forward. "You don't get to bargain anymore." Marcus laughed. "And what are you going to do?" "Kill me." Elias raised his weapon. Bruno stepped between them. No. Elias stared at him. "Move." Bruno shook his head. "No more killing." Marcus smiled. "Your father said the same thing." Bruno looked at him. "Where is he?" Marcus's expression became serious. "A town called St. Marin." Bruno repeated the name softly. "St. Marin." Victor nodded. "It's on the northern coast." Bruno looked at Daniel. "You knew." Daniel shook his head. No. Bruno turned toward Elena. "You." She shook her head. No. Marcus smiled. 3 days later, Bruno stood beneath a pale morning sky in the small coastal town of St. Marin, staring at a weathered blue house overlooking the sea, and for several minutes he could not move because the man standing on the porch was the same man from the photographs, the same face he had carried in his memories, only older now, thinner, with silver in his hair and a tiredness in his eyes that no photograph could ever capture. His father was alive. Bruno's breath caught in his throat. Daniel stopped several steps behind him, while Elena covered her mouth and began to cry. Victor quietly lowered his head. Nobody spoke. The old man looked at Bruno for a long moment before whispering, "You came." Bruno could barely answer. "Dad." His father nodded. Bruno walked forward slowly, as though afraid that one sudden movement might turn the entire scene into a dream. Then his father opened his arms. Bruno stepped into them, and 17 years of unanswered questions collapsed into one embrace. His father's jacket smelled of salt water and cedar, exactly like Bruno remembered from childhood. Bruno held him tightly, tears running freely down his face. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you leave me?" His father closed his eyes. "Because every day I stayed away was a day you were alive." Bruno pulled back. "You could have told me." "I tried." "You could have come home." "I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" His father's eyes filled with tears. "Because your mother made me promise that if keeping you alive required you to hate me, I would accept that hatred." Bruno looked away, struggling to breathe. His father touched his shoulder. "I am sorry." Bruno shook his head. "I spent years believing you abandoned us." "I know." "I hated you." "I know." "And you accepted that?" His father smiled sadly. "Every day." Bruno looked at him. "Was it worth it?" His father stared toward the ocean. No father should have to answer that question. Behind them, Elena approached. Her father looked at her and immediately broke down. He had not seen his daughter since she was a child. Elena ran into his arms. He held her as if trying to recover every missing year at once. "I'm sorry," he whispered repeatedly. Elena cried against his chest. "I thought you were dead." "I know." Daniel watched silently. His father eventually turned toward him. "You kept your promise." Daniel shook his head. "I almost didn't." "But you did." Bruno looked between them. "So what happens now?" His father looked toward the house. "Now you learn everything." Inside the house, the walls were covered with photographs, documents, maps, and handwritten notes. Bruno finally saw the complete picture. His father had spent 17 years protecting the original foundation funds, which had been hidden and preserved through a network of trusted people. Maria, Elena's mother, had helped establish the second foundation, one designed to provide housing, education, food, and employment to people abandoned by society. Marcus had tried to seize the money. Elias had helped him at first before turning against him. Victor had spent years protecting the remaining evidence. Daniel had carried the original ledger. Adrian had preserved the restaurant's hidden records. Every person had played a different role in the long struggle, and every secret had been connected to the same idea: that wealth meant nothing if it could not be used to protect people who had been forgotten. Bruno listened quietly as his father explained everything. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Why did you choose Daniel?" His father smiled. "Because Daniel reminded me why the foundation existed." Bruno remembered the restaurant, the laughter, the insults, the manager's contempt. Daniel standing alone beneath the chandelier, soaking wet and ashamed. "You knew what would happen?" Bruno asked. His father shook his head. "Not exactly. I only knew that one day you might encounter someone society had decided was invisible. And you wanted to see what I would do." "No," his father looked directly into his eyes. "I wanted you to decide for yourself who you would become." Bruno lowered his head. "I almost walked away." "But you didn't." Bruno smiled faintly. "No," his father squeezed his hand. "That's all I ever wanted." Months later, the story of what happened inside that luxury restaurant became widely known, although much of the conspiracy remained private for legal reasons. Marcus was arrested after the financial evidence was turned over to investigators. Several executives and officials connected to the foundation were investigated. Elias cooperated with authorities and publicly admitted his role in the past. Adrian reopened the restaurant under a new philosophy, removing the old private entrance that had once symbolized exclusion. Daniel received something he had not possessed in years: a home. But Bruno refused to let the story end there. He remembered the way Daniel had been treated that night, and he could not forget the humiliation in his eyes when people laughed at him simply because he was homeless. So Bruno helped rebuild the foundation his father had started. The first new center opened months later. It provided meals, temporary housing, medical assistance, job training, showers, clothing, and most importantly, a place where people were treated like human beings. Daniel stood beside Bruno during the opening ceremony. He wore a clean dark suit, but he still kept the same old envelope in his pocket. Bruno noticed it. "You still carry that?" Daniel smiled. "Every day." "Why?" "To remind myself that one envelope changed everything." Bruno laughed softly. "I think you changed everything." Daniel shook his head. "No. You did." Bruno looked around the crowded center. Formerly homeless men and women were eating at long tables. Volunteers moved between them carrying food. Children played in a safe courtyard. People who had once slept beneath bridges were now receiving keys to small apartments. Bruno's father watched from the doorway, his eyes filled with quiet pride. Elena stood beside him. Victor remained in the background, refusing attention. Adrian had become one of the foundation's administrators. Even Elias, after completing his legal obligations, eventually began working with organizations dedicated to helping people affected by the financial system he had once helped exploit. But the most important change happened inside Bruno himself. Fame had once taught him that people watched everything he did. That night taught him that the most important decisions often happen when nobody was watching. One evening, almost a year after the restaurant incident, Bruno returned to the same luxury restaurant where everything had begun. The chandeliers still glowed. The marble floor still reflected the golden lights. The tables were still covered with white linen. But the atmosphere was different. Daniel sat beside him, wearing the same simple watch he had worn the first night. The manager, Adrian, no longer stood at the entrance deciding who belonged. A sign near the door read, "Every guest deserves dignity." Bruno looked around the room. "Do you remember this place?" Daniel smiled. "Unfortunately." Bruno laughed. "I remember you asking for black coffee. I still prefer it. No sugar." "Never." They both laughed. Then the restaurant doors opened. A young homeless man entered hesitantly, looking frightened and embarrassed. He glanced around as if expecting someone to order him out. Bruno immediately stood. The room became quiet. The young man whispered, "I'm sorry. I was told someone here could help me." Bruno smiled. "They can." He walked toward him. "Come sit with us." The young man looked confused. "Are you sure?" Bruno nodded. "I'm sure." The young man sat at the table. A waiter brought him food. No one laughed. No one stared with disgust. No one asked him to leave. Daniel watched Bruno quietly. "Your father would be proud." Bruno looked toward the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered beneath the night sky. "I hope so." Daniel smiled. "He is." Bruno looked back at him. "How do you know?" Daniel tapped the old envelope in his pocket. "Because your father told me something once." "What?" Daniel leaned closer. "He said that one day, you would understand that the greatest thing a person can give another isn't money." Bruno smiled. "What is it?" Daniel looked toward the young man sitting at their table. "A reason to believe they still matter." Bruno became silent. He looked at the restaurant, at the people around him, at Daniel, and then toward the city outside. The world had not become perfect. There were still people sleeping on sidewalks, families struggling to survive, and wealthy rooms where people still judged others by appearances. But Bruno had learned something that night that no amount of fame could have taught him. Kindness was not weakness. Compassion was not charity. And dignity was not something a person had to earn. It belonged to everyone. Years later, when people asked Bruno about the night that changed his life, he never talked about the money, the conspiracy, the missing years, or the family secrets first. He talked about a man standing alone in the rain. He talked about a room full of people who looked away. And he talked about the moment he realized that sometimes the person society considers the least important can be the person carrying the most important truth. Bruno would always remember the words that started everything.